Good evening, and welcome to Northeast Wilderness Trust Speaker Series, the last in this event, in this series this spring. We're delighted that you are here. We have a very big group tonight. I think we have roughly 300 folks who are signed up to attend. It's going to take us a couple of minutes to seat everybody in this digital Zoom room. So make yourself comfortable, grab a beverage, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. And a little bit of housekeeping while folks are getting assembled and we're getting started, getting everyone in the Zoom room. I will say that I wanted to let you know that the chat function of Zoom will not be working tonight. You can, and we will hope that you will be prompted to ask questions by the panelists and by the discussion that we hope will be spirited and engaging. And please use that Zoom bar tool, the Q&A tool in your Zoom bar. We will collate and curate those questions and hope to get to as many of them as possible tonight. Well, I think we'll get started, and folks who are just joining us can come in as they join. I'm Tom Butler, Senior Fellow of Northeast Wilderness Trust. And for folks new to this speaker series or to Northeast Wilderness Trust, we work across New England and the Adirondacks region of upstate New York to protect wilderness areas, that is, wild places where natural processes direct the ebb and flow of life. Broadcasting here tonight from world headquarters of the Trust, we have a team across the region, staff of roughly 23 now, and we now protect more than 95,000 acres that will remain forever wild. We're on track to dramatically expand that portfolio of privately owned wildlands in the next few years. One of those current wilderness trust preserves here, the Eagle Mountain Wilderness in the eastern part of New York's Adirondack Park, embodies the kind of beauty and landscape connectivity that a rewilding approach to conservation is intended to foster. Viewed from this long view, it looks pretty incredible. It looks beautiful and wild. But of course, that region that's now covered by Adirondack Park once looked more like this. And in this historical example of wilderness recovery that the Adirondack Park presents, and so many others across the globe, and some of which we're going to hear about tonight, we can see that rewilding works. Where we step back and let nature take over, good things happen. And that is wildly hopeful. Now, while Northeast Wilderness Trust's focus is on this part of North America, we're inspired to be part of that global rewilding movement, part of a community of nature lovers on every continent, perhaps with the exception of Antarctica. I don't know of a rewilding Antarctica effort yet, but everywhere else there are groups of people working to protect natural areas and restore wildlife populations, all the while helping to rewild hearts and minds as we learn to be better neighbors in the community of life with our wild cousins. I am super excited and honored to be hosting this evening's conversation with two extraordinarily accomplished conservationists, Kathleen Fitzgerald and Sebastián Di Martino. But before I introduce them, I want to set the stage with a very brief reminder about the history of that word rewilding. Now, today in our circles, rewilding is a pretty common term. People use it for a whole variety of things to refer to everything from backyard pollinator gardens to more nature-friendly farming practices, even to the spiritual practices of individual people. But there was even, I believe, a vegan beer hall in Massachusetts called Rewild for a time. But in the beginning, when the term was coined about 35 years ago by the great wilderness conservation advocate Dave Foreman, he used it as poetic shorthand for something very simple, for wilderness recovery, and specifically for large-scale wilderness recovery, the kind that would allow for the reestablishment of natural processes across whole landscapes and the maintenance of intact food webs, including apex carnivores like sharks and jaguars and wolves and mountain lions, all with the ultimate goal of allowing the evolutionary odyssey on life to continue, for this little beautiful blue and green planet to continue producing exceptional diversity, richness, and integrity. Decades later, when the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth was drafted for and adopted by the World Wilderness Congress in 2020, it included a definitions section that really captured the essence of a rewilding vision. And that reads in part, rewilding means helping nature heal. Rewilding means giving space back to wildlife and returning wildlife back to the land as well as to the seas. Rewilding means the mass recovery of ecosystems and the life-supporting functions they provide. Rewilding means restoring and protecting specific places on land and in the oceans where nature is free to direct the ebb and flow of life. Rewilding is also about the way that we think. It is about understanding that we are one species among many, bound together in an intricate web of life that ties us to the atmosphere, the weather, the tide, the soils, the fresh water, the oceans, and all living creatures on the planet. In short, then, rewilding efforts may occur at many scales and always be focused on a specific place, but with systemic health in mind. So places, processes, and species, and people are all part of the equation, as we're going to discuss this evening. Which brings us to the introduction of our guest speakers, both of whom are biologists by academic training and visionary conservationists by practice. Kathleen Fitzgerald is currently project director for the Pew Charitable Trusts, working with their Enduring Earth partnership. She formerly lived and worked in Africa for many years, where she was vice president of the African Wildlife Foundation. And long ago, nearing a quarter century now, she was co-founder and the first executive director of a little land trust in New England called Northeast Wilderness Trust. Sebastián Di Martino is conservation director at Rewilding Argentina, an independent NGO that was spun off from the family foundation, Tompkins Conservation. Sebastián oversees a large team of biologists and veterinarians who are working to reintroduce missing species and restore ecological conditions in several outstanding natural areas in Argentina and soon beyond Argentina's borders. And all the while improving local economic vitality in the process. And his efforts, along with all of his colleagues at Rewilding Argentina, have been widely lauded as a globally important and arguably the most ambitious and effective rewilding initiative in the Americas. So we're thrilled to have you both with us tonight, and we're delighted to have you take up the mic, Kathleen. So to begin your presentation, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks to Northeast Wilderness Trust for this incredible webinar series. I'm going to hope that my technology works and that you'll be able to see my slides. There we go. And thanks, Tom, for the introduction and really setting the stage nicely. I'm really happy to be with everyone. I got sidetracked by looking at all the names of the participants, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to speak tonight about the wildlife and wildlands recovery taking place in Africa. And in my presentation, what I want to do is first introduce you to the context of conservation in Africa. And then I'm going to share with you 3 case studies of wildlife and wildlands recovery taking place in Africa. So for starters, Africa is teeming with wildlife and wildlands, from the Congo Basin in the central part of the continent with the great tropical forest, essentially providing a lung for our planet, to the savannas of East Africa, to the vast Miombo woodlands in Southern Africa that host the largest population of elephants. A quarter of the world's biological diversity is in Africa, and a quarter of the world's mammal species are in Africa, and a fifth of the bird species. I could go on and on. The countries in Africa have protected 19% of the land area and 17% of the sea. So they've done an extraordinary job in creating a network of protected and conserved areas across the continent. But I'm going to share with you some bad news, and then I'm going to share with you some good news. And the bad news is that the wildlife trends are declining. And I picked these two species. On the left, you should be seeing a black rhino. And on the right, there's a map that shows the range of lions. And I picked these species because they're emblematic of Africa. And over my lifetime, these populations have declined dramatically. So on the left, again, the black rhinos have declined from 1973 from about 37,000 black rhinos to the current population, which is about 5,500. And lion, over a 50-year period, a similar decline. 50 years, a 75% decline. Now, this has happened from direct threats like poaching and retaliatory killing and habitat loss. But one of the main drivers for these threats is a lack of financial resources for conservation across Africa. So again, on that last slide, I shared with you the network of protected areas. But across the board, there is a dearth of funding to support protected areas. And so they're not achieving their ecological targets. So the question we always ask is, well, how much do we need? How much do we need globally to secure biological diversity? And one of the studies that I often point to indicates that we need $711 billion globally to secure biodiversity. It's a big number to wrap your head around. And so we were curious what this meant in Africa. So we looked at 240 protected areas in Africa that support lion. So using lion as a proxy for ecological health, what we found was $1 billion is needed on an annual basis to support protected areas with lion. We found that a majority of the range countries had a massive deficit in funding for protected areas. And in fact, only 10 to 20% of the protected areas in Africa which support lion were adequately funded. And so coming up with ways to leverage the finance that we need to support conservation in Africa is a key priority. Now, I told you I was going to give you some good news after sharing with you those declining numbers. The other thing we looked at was lion density compared to protected area budgets. And here's the good news. What we found was there's a direct correlation between lion density and protected area budgets. So if we leverage finance for conservation, and if that money is allocated in the right place, we see an increase in density of wildlife. Here I'm showing you an example of lions. So that's the good news. We know how to turn the trends around. One of the number one mechanisms being used across Africa is a tool called collaborative management partnerships. And I love the name of this tool because it's collaboration and it's partnership. And in the map here, you can see there are 40 examples of collaborative management partnerships. What a CMP is, and of course I'm using an acronym as a conservationist, it is a management agreement between a protected area authority and an NGO partner, whereby that protected area agency devolves management responsibilities to a partner. And across the board, so for example, the 40 that you see on the slide here, we analyzed all 40. What we found was through this partnership, we saw ecological, economic, and social recovery. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. So the first example I want to share is in Mozambique. And Mozambique is in Southern Africa on the east side. And in Mozambique is a park called Gorongosa National Park, and it's about 1 million acres. And Mozambique suffered a civil war that was about 15 years. And so at the end of that civil war, Gorongosa and other areas across the country were just dilapidated. Social infrastructure gone, wildlife poached out, poverty high, and the government of Mozambique entered into a 20-year management agreement with the Gregory Carr Foundation for the management of Gorongosa, and now it's expanded into those Cutada areas, which you can see on the map. Over the period of the management agreement thus far, what has happened is an unbelievable recovery story. The operational budget has gone up, wildlife numbers have gone up. At the bottom of this slide, you can see, for example, elephant populations. They've increased from 200 to 781. Communities are employed. There are about 1,300 staff, permanent and seasonal, most of them local staff. And in the buffer zones, Gorongosa has implemented a suite of activities for the communities that are living in those buffer zones. So food security programs, education programs, health programs. So Gorongosa has been named a park for the people because in addition to the extraordinary recovery Gorongosa has had ecologically, the communities living around Gorongosa are the advocates for this protected area. The other amazing thing that they've done in Gorongosa is it is the only protected area in the world where you can get a conservation biology degree inside the national park, which I just think is tremendous. One of the other things I wanted to highlight about Gorongosa, if you are bored on a Saturday night, I urge you to watch the film Our Gorongosa. It's an extraordinary film about the park, about the wildlife recovery that's taken place in the park. But what this film has done is it's put Mozambique on the map as a leader in conservation. And that's important because of the political relevance it brings to the protected area. If you are the president of Mozambique and you're making a decision about budgets or you're making a decision about land use, if you have a protected area that's not generating revenue or that's not supported by communities, you're going to be tempted to de-gazette that protected area. So this film and all the work that's associated has made Gorongosa an emblem for the country, which has brought political support. The other thing I want to highlight is the support that Gorongosa has provided to girls. And you can see here Aurora in the top right, she's the president of the foundation. Dominique on the bottom right is the head of the elephant program in the park. Gorongosa has made a real commitment to supporting girls at all ages. And I think you know from global studies, the return on investment when investing in girls is extraordinary. I want to take you now to another example, and I want to take you to Rwanda, which is a small landlocked country in the middle of Africa. And Rwanda is known to most people for two reasons. One, the mountain gorilla. Maybe you heard about Dian Fossey or you watched the film about the mountain gorillas. And the other reason why it's known is because of the genocide, which took place in Rwanda and ended in 1992. A similar story to Mozambique. At the end of the genocide, the country, socially, infrastructure, economy, ecology was just eroded. Over the last 25 years, what has happened in Rwanda is extraordinary. Again, ecological, social, and economic recovery. The park you can see in the upper corner, Volcanoes National Park, is where the mountain gorillas live. Mountain gorillas are the only great ape increasing in numbers, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about that. So they have gone from about 250 to about 1,100 mountain gorillas, an unbelievable recovery story when you think about the history of conflict within this region. The other reason why the numbers have gone up, besides investment in the protected area and in mountain gorillas themselves, is in Rwanda, 15% of all the revenue from the protected areas goes to communities. So the communities that live outside of protected areas support mountain gorilla conservation. The lodge you can see in the upper left-hand corner is a lodge that we provide an investment capital in. It is wholly owned by a community that lives outside of Volcanoes National Park. They derive benefits from this lodge. And again, they are the #1 advocates for mountain gorillas. The other two protected areas you can see, Nungwe National Park, where we have chimpanzees, and Akagera National Park, are also managed through a collaborative management partnership. Akagera National Park, where you see the lion in the eastern part of the country, was degraded, it was eroded, it was a rebel hideout area. Over the last 10 years, this park, again, has recovered ecologically. I was going to show you more charts, but I thought a photo of the park would be better. They've reintroduced rhino. They've seen natural recovery of other species. Lion have recovered. Tourism investment is back because now there's actually something to see. Community engagement is high, and there's extraordinary support for Akagera National Park through this partnership. The last example I want to share with you is in Kenya. So I want to take you to Kenya, which is in East Africa. And I want to give you another example of the recovery taking place. In Kenya, most of the wildlife we found either resides outside a protected area or moves between protected areas and the buffer zones. So conserving these areas is absolutely critical. And in Kenya, there's been an explosion of community conservancies, which is really exciting. 11% of Kenya is now protected through conservancies. These conservancies not only provide habitat for key species like black and white rhino, gravy zebra, wild dog, but they also provide benefits to households and jobs. And I want to take you to southern Kenya. 90% of all the tourists that come to Kenya come to see the wildebeest, right? So the wildebeest migrate between Kenya and Tanzania. And this area of Kenya was largely degraded. It was overgrazed, the numbers of wildlife were down, but over the last 20 years, the Maasai, this is their traditional territory, they have formed 15 community conservancies, protecting over 370,000 acres for wildlife. And the recovery has been nothing short of incredible. Lion populations have doubled, ungulate species have increased, human-wildlife conflict has decreased, and communities are benefiting. In fact, the conservancies rival the size of the Masai Mara. So I'm going to conclude here, and I hope these case studies give you hope about wildlife recovery. And also, I want to point out that these 3 case studies, while they're different countries, different tools, the one thing they have in common is partnership. And I think you all know the reason why you're here this evening in this webinar is we face extraordinary challenges in biodiversity conservation. And partnership is one of the key things that's going to help us mitigate the threats that we face. It's also something that the Northeast Wilderness Trust prioritizes, which is something that gives me hope. So thanks, Tom. I'll hand it over back to you.
Kathleen, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have many questions. I assume that our attendees also have many questions. Just a reminder that the chat function is not working, but the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar should be operable. Send those questions via that Q&A button. We'll get to those in a few minutes after Sebastián's presentation. And welcome you, Sebastián. You have the floor. I'll let you start to share your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's share. Let me see where I have the, wait, wait, here it is. Share the screen. Do you see it? Okay, so I also want to thank you for inviting me to this presentation. It was great also to listen to Kathleen's presentation before mine. We always say that although the rewilding word was coined in the US, the masters of rewilding are the African countries for sure. The scale that in which they are working is massive, really incredible, and we always try to go there to learn from them. But okay, we are going to talk about Argentina, a South American country, a country that is in the southern corner of South America, kind of far away from everywhere. And we are going to talk a lot about this animal, the jaguar, that for us, the jaguar is a symbol. Yeah, it's, although I'm going to talk about the jaguar, we are going to talk about nature's recovery in general. We are going to talk a lot about economic development because the jaguar for us is a symbol of that also. We are going to talk about community well-being and a little bit about coexistence between humans and wildlife. Yeah, the jaguar is an incredible example of that, of coexistence, something that we need more and more as we recover natural ecosystems and species. But let's see a little bit about the jaguar in the American continent. Every time I give a talk, especially to people in the US, I like to show this map because most of the countries in the American continent, including the United States and Argentina, we are kind of united by the jaguar. It's the biggest cat of the American continent. It used to be distributed in all this area. Actually, something that is kind of, I don't know, a coincidence, but a nice coincidence is that the northern border of the jaguar distribution was the Colorado River in the US, and the southern distribution of the southern border of the distribution of the jaguar was the Colorado River in northern Patagonia. But we are not only united by the jaguar, but also we are united by the tragedy of losing the jaguar. As you can see, the jaguar lost, and the jaguar is also a symbol of that tragedy of losing nature and many of these incredible species. We lost about 50% of the jaguar original distribution in the American continent. In Argentina, it was even more brutal. We lost 95% of the distribution of the jaguar. We only have remaining breeding populations in the northwest and northeast of the country. That is about less than 200 adult jaguars surviving. But not only the jaguar is something that we have in common, the US and Argentina. Luckily for us, we also have in common this couple, Douglas and Chris Tompkins. They came, or they arrived to Argentina late in the 90s with, I think, incredible values that we try to preserve, to observe, and very bold ideas. And one of those ideas was bringing back the jaguar to the Corrientes province that you can see there in the map. Is in the northeastern part of Argentina, close to the Brazil and Paraguay borders. And they came to the Ibera wetlands, yeah, because that was a place that it seemed to be kind of good to bring back a top predator that went extinct 70 years before the Tompkins arrived to this place. And, you know, although Doug died in 2015, and since then we became an independent organization, as Tom mentioned, that's when Rewilding Argentina was born. We continue with their work, we continue with their legacy. So the strategy to bring the jaguar is based mostly in 4 pillars. One is the creation or protection of the territory. Yeah, we need a territory in which we can bring back not only the jaguar, but many species that went extinct. And in doing so, we are able to help the government, the national government of Argentina and the provincial government of Corrientes, to create a park, a natural park, category 2 of IUCN. That is the Ibera Park, is the largest natural park of Argentina that covers almost 2 million acres. We bought part of that land, and then we donate the land to the national government to set a national park. And the provincial government did or protected part of that land also as a provincial park. So this is like one thing that we need to bring back species, a territory that is well protected and in which you get rid of the threats that made the species disappear. Then another thing that we had to do in that territory is to create or to bring back a new economy. In a place that was dominated by cattle ranching, we create a new economy that is based on nature tourism and wildlife watching. Yeah, and that is the main economy or the main economic activity for local people in Iberá right now. There are right now 10 small towns surrounding Iberá. In many of them, the nature tourism is already the main economy. In others are still growing. And there are more than 1,000 people that rely on this economy. And it's very important that the nature tourism is based on wildlife watching, because that way you create social and then political support to bring back species like the jaguars that are big predators that is not easy to get permits. And once you have this, you can start bringing back a big predator like the jaguar. So that's when the rewilding began. In Iberá, we didn't start with the jaguar. It was almost impossible to start with such a big predator, a controversial species. So we started working with giant anteaters, pampas deer, collared peccaries. Then we started to work with the jaguar. It was a long process. We started building a reintroduction center in 2012, so more than 10 years ago. And rewilding is basically doing a lot of active management, yeah, in order to bring back this species, as I said, and including the top predator for the first time in the Americas. In Iberá, the reintroduction project for the jaguar in Iberá is the first one and only one for this species, well, in the American continent, worldwide. So, and here we needed to start from captive breeding. We started building this reintroduction center in 2012. In 2015, we managed to bring the first individuals to the center, breeders that came from captivity that were impossible to release, but we could breed them, and the mother gave birth in very big pens, and these calves were born there, and they grew there with their mother, hunting like prey for them in a way that made them to be releasable animals, yeah, without human contact. They grew like in a semi-natural condition. But something that was important is that that is something that is kind of related to the Africa. In Latin America, we don't have the culture of rewilding. We don't have the culture of translocating species. So for us, it was impossible to translocate wild jaguars at the starting of the project. So that's why we needed to start with captive breeding. But as the project was getting more and more well-known, we managed to do wild-to-wild translocations of jaguars also for the first time last year. So that helped a lot with the development of the Iberá reintroduction project for jaguars, because when you are able to do this wild-to-wild translocation that are so common in Africa to restore all these incredible places like Kathleen was mentioning, you can speed up all these processes and you can have much larger impact with restoration. So far in Iberá, and after 70 years of extinction, we have the first reintroduced population of jaguars worldwide. These are between now in Iberá. We started to release the first animals at the beginning of 2021, 4 years ago. And now we have a population between 35 to 40 jaguars. So the population is growing really fast. That is like 20% of the actual Argentina's jaguar population, and is the largest population of jaguars in a national park in the country. And of course, as I was saying, when you bring back the species, you not only, a species like the jaguar, you not only protect big pieces of land, you not only bring a new economy for local people and then recover species. The fourth pillar is the recovery also of the culture of the region, because the jaguar is so much present in the cultures of the countryside of Argentina. And I think this kind of species in most of the cultures in other places of the world, that when you lose the species, then you start to lose culture. And when you recover the species, and that species contributes to the economy of the region, then you bring back the culture, you bring back the identity and the pride of local people for that territory. That is also something really important. So right now, Iberá, after 20 years or a little bit more of work since the Tompkins came, is starting to look like this. But when the Tompkins came, the jaguar was not in this drawing. Also the bird-faced curassow and the red and green macaw, two species that we are reintroducing, big fruit eaters, seed dispersers, with incredible ecological roles in restoring the forest. The giant anteater was not here. The collared peccary was not here. The same with the giant otter or the pampas deer. So now Iberá is starting to look like it was 150, 200 years ago. It's becoming a complete and functional ecosystem that I think that is one of the main goals of rewilding, restore that kind of ecosystem, bringing back the species in number big enough so they can fulfill their ecological role. And after working in Iberá, we started to work with another reintroduction project in northern Argentina, in the dry Chaco, in El Impenetrable National Park. I wanted to mention this because in El Impenetrable, rather than doing captive breeding, we are mostly translocating wild jaguars, so the process is going much and much faster. And for ending this presentation, I wanted to share to share with you this video. It's not a very good one. It was made with a cell phone. It's a jaguar swimming in the Paraná River. The Paraná River is the border between Argentina and Paraguay. This video was made by a group of Brazilian fishermen, and this jaguar is a young male that was born in Iberá as part of the reintroduced population. It was born wild, and is 150 to 200 kilometers from the place where he was born. The jaguars are now starting to leave Iberá, the protected area, and they are entering to other places, and they are using mostly the rivers as highways. So the jaguars are showing us what we need to do in the future, what our work has to be in the future. And you can see here the American continent. This is northern Argentina in the border with Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil. And as you can see, all these countries, we are connected through big rivers, the Paraná, the Iguazu, the Bermejo. And as I said, in Argentina, only breeding populations of jaguars were surviving in the northwest of the country, here where you have the Baritú and Calilegua national parks, and only in the northeast of the countries where we have the Iguazu National Park that we share with Brazil. These two breeding populations are kind of small, isolated. They are connected through rivers, as you can see, but this distance is very, very long. A jaguar will never make it to go from one breeding population to another. But something that is good is that now we have another breeding population in the middle that we restore, that is Iberá Park, and then another one that is in El Impenetrable National Park. So we are kind of shrinking those distances that are still big but smaller. And our future agenda is we need to build more stepping stones of breeding populations of jaguars and many other species so they can be naturally connected. And the good thing we think is that Iberá, from being a place without jaguars until 4 years ago, now is a place that can be a source of jaguar to repopulate other areas. So this kind of regional vision is the one that we think we need. And of course, the rivers, they don't respect political borders. So this vision that we are trying to develop, we are starting to work with NGOs from Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil. So we need to go out of the parks. The agenda that was kind of restoring populations cannot be only that anymore, and we need to work a lot with connectivity and coexistence to ensure the long-term viability of these populations. So thank you very much.
Sebastián, thank you so much. Kathleen, would you also rejoin us for a little bit of a freewheeling conversation? A reminder again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, use that Q&A Zoom bar function. I'm going to take a personal liberty here and start us off with a handful of questions. Those were both fascinating presentations. And there is a natural inclination to want to get down into the weeds about conservation policy and practice and go deep into the wonkiness, which we'll get to. But before I do that, I want to pose a more personal, emotional question to both of you. I'm curious. I know a little bit about your backgrounds, but how did you both become people of the wild? Kathleen, how does a young person from Massachusetts fall in love with Africa? And Sebastián, how did you come to be in this field of wildlife recovery? Kath, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, my story is quite simple. And I feel really lucky. The summer before my sophomore year at university, I spent 30 days in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, and I literally had an aha moment and said, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to protect wild nature. And I marched back to campus and changed my major to an environmental studies major. And that's what I've been doing since. So, you know, people talk about those pivotal moments. I literally had that aha moment, and I've been fortunate since then to work in some of our globe's most extraordinary landscapes. And so I'm deeply grateful.
And that university that you were attending had a program in Africa, is that right?
It did. So I went to St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, and my junior year, I spent a semester in Kenya. My research was on elephants. So I sat in a tree and photographed elephants for identification, which was like my happy place. And so it took me a while to get back to Africa. I eventually went and got a graduate degree and did my research on wolves in Canada, but then moved to Africa in 2007.
Fantastic. Sebastián, tell us a little bit about your history and how you got into this work.
Well, I think it was kind of the same. When I was a kid, I was lucky to go a lot to nature, mostly with my father that was a paleontologist. He always take me and my other 6 brothers and sisters to dig for fossils. And also my mother, although she was a mathematician, she liked to spend vacations on national parks mostly. And I think when you are like a kid, everything is about happiness and discovering mysteries and about, I don't know, everything is so passionate. And I think this work kind of remembers me when I was a kid. It makes me happy. Every day you discover something. So that's one of the reasons for sure that I work in nature and restoring nature. And I think the other one is I was born in a city of Argentina, Bahía Blanca, that is in the middle of the Pampas. The Pampas is a region that is completely transformed to agriculture and cattle ranching. And since I was a kid, I realized that 150 years ago, where I lived, there were jaguars and pampas deer and Maine wolf, all completely extinct. And I dreamed about how the place would be with those species around. And I think working in Rewilding Argentina is kind of a, I don't know if a revenge, but something like that is like having the opportunity of my dreams come true, for sure.
Wonderful. Both of your presentations touched on the very particular sociological, economic, political questions and challenges of a particular place where you're trying to do large-scale conservation. And I'm curious to touch on that. I want to follow up a little bit. Sebastián, you glanced over, you articulated how the foundation of a rewilding approach was first to get that protected area, Iberá Park, in both a federal or national and a provincial section of it designated. But that made it sound easy. You just kind of glanced over it. I believe that the work to actually secure those protections and then to begin to transform the economy away from resource dependence and toward wildlife watching was the work of many years and must have required a tremendous amount of political support. Can you take us back a little bit to the beginning and tell us how that happened and how it was that you gained the political support necessary for the parks designation?
Yeah, you need to build first social support that then it turns into political support, I think. And it was very difficult, especially starting with a couple of Americans in Argentina buying big pieces of land. There were all kinds of conspiracy theories about that they were coming here to steal the water or to set military base for the United States or even to create a new Jewish state. So starting from there, we need to build a political support for creating a park and then bringing back all these species. And I think we did it with this economic approach. Although we work a lot in the recovery of the culture, we did a lot of education activities. At the end, in countries like Argentina, and I think Africa is the same, people need jobs. So if you don't link the park creation and the return of species with job creation, then it's kind of difficult. It's kind of difficult to explain what you want to do because we can understand it, but conservationists are not the ones taking political decisions. So you need to explain the politicians, the business people, even the cattle ranchers in a way that they understand. And for us, working with this model that we call it economy of nature or producción de naturaleza was key, because that way people could easily understand what we were doing. And by working in the territory, the first one that understood what we wanted to do were the local politicians, especially the mayors of the small town, that they started to see the change. Then the governor of the province, and at the end, the nation. But for sure, it's very hard to create a national park, and especially to bring back a big predator in an economy that is dominated by cattle ranching, for example. Because they are the jaguar and many other species, they are problems that you can coexist with or not, but still problems. But in this other economy, the jaguar is an opportunity for local people. So I think that is what changed everything and how we could build political support.
Kathleen, a related question about the local particular challenges of doing large-scale conservation in Africa. Our friends at Rewilding Argentina and Rewilding Chile across the Andes do some of their work in areas that are very remote and lightly settled. But in Africa, there are many places where you're trying to do important wildlife and land conservation projects in areas that are very densely settled, where there's a high population, human population density, and therefore the possibility for lots of conflicts. Can you tell us a little, you want to give us a little background about how you manage that and how it is possible to do conservation in an area with such human population pressures and the challenges that presents?
Yeah, it was funny. I was looking at Argentina compared to Kenya, right? And the population density in Argentina is 17 per kilometer square, whereas Kenya is 6 times that, right? So they are different dynamics, but to what Sebastian was saying, creating political relevance, creating social buy-in is part of the strategy, right? And the recovery stories in Africa have been successful, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that high-level political support, which you really need. And if you look at Africa, I think about 63% of the countries in Africa have signed on to the 30 by 30 pledge, right? Which is pretty amazing. They've all committed to protecting 30% by 2030. And they've also, some of them have developed strategies for how to get there. And as we know, the 30 by 30 pledge is not just about setting aside areas, but it's about making them effective, making management effective, and doing so with communities. So that really sets the stage. And then the other thing that I find interesting is take Kenya, for example, and that, I showed that conservancy map. The reason why people are engaging in conservation varies wildly, right? So if you look in the northern part of Kenya, those conservancies, if you talk to those members, they're engaging in conservation for security reasons. That area is riddled with conflict because of cattle, people stealing cattle, cattle rustling. And conservancies have created stability and security. Whereas if you go to southern Kenya, they'll tell you they want to engage in conservancies because it maintains their cultural way of life. So I think understanding, number one, the drivers, having that political support, and then one of the key things is figuring out what the best tool is. And of course, that depends on the country, right? The social aspects as well as the legal structure.
Right. Related, we're starting to get wonderful questions in the Q&A, so keep them coming, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible. This is for both of you. A question on funding. Of course, large-scale conservation, whether it's land protection or oriented toward wildlife recovery, is expensive. It costs money to run these projects. And much of that money comes from external sources, from Europe and North America, through to NGOs that working in these parts of the world. And so the question is, how do funds get appropriately channeled to these projects to avoid corruption? And what are the best practices that you can suggest to, in fact, avoid that corruption and get the funding to where it needs to go? I'll let either of you want to weigh in on that.
Well, for us, we rely a lot, as you said, in philanthropical money. Although there are other tools that are appearing, like, for example, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, well, some others, but most of our fundings, yeah, they come from philanthropic money from the US and Europe. And really, we are the ones managing those funds. Is what we donate to the government is the land. And for us, something that is very important regarding sustainability of this model is that how we create sustainability on land protection is by donating the land to the government. Argentina has a strong national park system, really is a good one, more than 100 years, very robust. So you can rely on the government, although you need to do some kind of control because you want the government like to be in the territory, managing the land. That is one way that you can give sustainability to land protection, donating that to the national government. Then the economic model has to become sustainable also. All the entrepreneurs that you help to run their business at the beginning, is like we subsidize them a lot. Then they also have to become sustainable. They work by themselves. They have a capacity of investing. And then the populations that we are restoring, as I mentioned, they also have to become sustainable. Because at the beginning, we do a lot of active management, but you cannot sustain that active management forever. So the important thing is that the model that we run on each territory has to become sustainable, so we can live, or at least we can reduce our operations to a minimum, and then we can start in another place. Because also we don't have a capacity to run more than 5, 6 of these big projects at the same time. So those projects, they need to kind of shrink and go by themselves if we want to have a big scale. Yeah.
Kathleen, do you want to weigh in on this question of funding and corruption?
Yeah, it's a great question. The collaborative management partnership, that PPP model that I highlighted, and more than 17 governments in Africa are using that as a way to enhance management of their protected areas. One of the key things about that mechanism is it provides funders with assurance of where their funding is going. So there are a number of private and public funders who have said, we're not going to provide any more protected area finance unless there is some form of a collaborative management partnership. Because as part of developing that partnership, there's a joint venture that's created, and often cases it's a company. So there's good governance, there's good management, and as a result, it has attracted significant funding. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism we're seeing in a number of countries in Africa is the creation of a conservation trust fund, which is managed by an independent board. So in Mozambique, for example, there's a conservation trust fund that's focused on biodiversity conservation, an independent board. Public and private funders give money there, and then that money is distributed. And so again, because of that good governance and transparency, it attracts funding. And the other thing I would say, and Sebastián, you touched on this, is diversification, right? I mean, we saw with COVID, for example, tourism is a major driver of funding for biodiversity in Africa. I mean, really high. And when COVID hit, tourism stopped, and rangers were laid off. There was no money for petrol and vehicles. And so the drive for diversifying revenue is very strong across Africa. And there's unbelievable innovation around that. Sebastián mentioned carbon. There's payment for ecosystem service. There's rhino bonds. I mean, there's a ton of creativity around innovative finance across Africa, which is very exciting because we need to diversify.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, some of the entrepreneurs that we help to start business in the different projects where we work, they work in recovering. We help them to recovering handicraft techniques and to do these artisanal products. And during COVID, what we did is many of the entrepreneurs, they switch to producing these artisanal products, and we started to sell them using all these web tools that you can sell to other places. So yeah, you need to diversify, and you need to, I don't know, be aware of these kind of strange things like COVID that sometimes can kill your model. Yeah.
You've both talked about the value of public-private partnerships and that collaborative approach, complementarity. I'm curious, Kathleen, we have a question for you about private conservancies in Africa. How you described, how they were growing. Could you talk a little bit more about that model? And specifically, the questioner is wondering how these conservancies compare to land trusts in North America.
It's a great question. I mean, the land tenure across Africa, again, there are 54 countries in Africa, so they're all different, right? But private land is not that common in Africa. In Southern Africa, there are private holdings. Some of the conservancies, for example, I mentioned in Kenya, They're community owned, so traditional territories. And those communities have created conservancies through land use planning and management. There are some private conservancies, for example, in central Kenya, but those are leases. Those are 99-year leases with the government of Kenya. That central part of Kenya, it's near Mount Kenya, is one of the most important areas for white and black rhinos. So they've done an incredible job, but it's a 99-year lease. So it's a concession of sorts for management. If you look at Southern Africa, so in South Africa, for example, Kruger National Park is one of the largest national parks in South Africa, and it's adjacent to Mozambique on the east, and then to the north is Zimbabwe, really important for rhinos. The western boundary of Kruger is abutted by private reserves, which again are absolutely critical for that large scale conservation. And historically, there were fences between Kruger and those private reserves on that boundary, and they've dropped those fences, which is amazing. So that area really is a mosaic of different land types.
Yeah, so I want to say that besides what we admire about Africa, that the amount of animals that you are translocating, that, as I said, you are like the masters. Another thing that amazes us is the different legal figures that they have to involve privates and communities with conservation that we don't have in Argentina and we don't have in most countries of Latin America. In Latin America, we have good figures for public conservation. National parks are the best example, but nothing to involve private. So the same rules that we apply to public lands is the rules that we apply to privates, and privates don't function like that. So in Argentina, private protection is like 0.03% of the territory. Is nothing. So we would like to bring figures to Argentina, like for example the conservancies among others. Yeah, and especially in countries like Argentina, where it's more than 95% of the country is privately owned. So we need to involve privates if we want to do conservation on a big scale. If not, it's impossible. The only strategy that we have now is buying private ranches and turn them into public land national parks. But we need to have other figures and conservancies are great. Yeah.
Well, and I mentioned South Africa. Sorry, Tom. In
Quite
South
right.
Africa, because there are private ranches, there's a tax benefit, right? And that was a major achievement in South Africa, where if you're managing your land for wildlife, you now get a tax benefit for doing that. Mm-hmm. So in Kenya, it's the opposite. If you're managing your land for wildlife, you actually pay more, right? So incentivizing, which they've done successfully in South Africa, is really an incredible achievement.
Question for both of you about rewilding. How do you balance rewilding to recreate historical ecosystems versus planning for how environments may shift in the future due to climate change?
Well, I think doing rewilding is preparing the ecosystem for climate change because ecosystems that are complete and functional are especially more resilient to climate change. But for sure, we need to create big protected areas. We need to connect those protected areas because all these movements of animals that I was kind of talking about that were mostly about dispersions or natural dispersions, those movements, we need to allow them in order to adapt to climate change. But I think rewilding is an incredible tool for climate change. I mean, we don't need to prepare rewilding for climate change. Doing rewilding is like what prepares the ecosystems to fight climate change.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's, in terms of planning taking place across countries, so Botswana is a good example where 29% of the country is protected. But their biggest challenge are some of the mega linkages between their protected areas. So they've put forward a vision for 2036 that looks at how do you connect those areas. So creating that large scale ecological connectivity is the best way of mitigating climate change. And there's a lot of great scenario modeling that's looking at, in particular, at corridors for wildlife movement, trying to anticipate how that's going to shift, and then using the precautionary principle, bigger is better.
Yeah, I'll make an editorial comment as well on the same point. At Northeast Wilderness Trust, we don't think about rewilding as returning to some particular historical moment in the past. We think about rewilding as going into the future with as healthy ecosystems as possible that can support vital human and natural communities. And as we like to say, every acre we protect is an old growth forest of the future. We're obviously thinking ahead, not about going back to any particular past or historical moment.
Exactly. You don't look for an endpoint.
Exactly. We're looking for
you prepare
future,
the ecosystems,
exactly, of healthy,
they can
functional
adapt,
ecosystems.
and evolve. Yeah.
And you on that point, you mentioned something important, that you want species that perform vital ecological roles to be back, not just as tokens, but in the numbers and the kind of abundance and distributed across the landscape so that they're performing their ecological roles. And this is one thing you didn't have a chance to talk about, the macaws, the return of that species, which are in fact a proxy for a very, very important natural community building process. Could you just, Sebastián, could you tell us a little bit about the macaws and what they do in the ecosystem?
Yeah, exactly. Because of and this brings us back to the question about climate change. Because of climate change, in Iberá in the last year we suffered really big fires. That was kind of something unknown in Iberá, in a wetland. But we suffer big fires, and the grasslands is kind of, they are adapted to fires, but forests don't. So we lose a lot of islands of forests in the middle of the grasslands. And for those islands, it's very hard to recover. But now that we have these big fruit eaters and seed dispersers like the macaws or the barefaced curassows, they are the ones that in part they are spreading the seeds, and especially they are eating the big fruits that nobody was eating in Iberá anymore. They are eating the big fruits and spreading the seeds to places that are kind of far away from the mother tree. So that's is an incredible example of how a rewilded ecosystem in which you bring back an ecological role that was completely lost helps to mitigate climate change and helps an ecosystem like Iberá to adapt to climate change.
Beautiful. Macaws as forest builders, forest planters. This is a question for both of you. Can your speakers provide advice to those of us who would like to visit and bring additional tourism support to these conservation areas, these parks?
Great question.
Would you like to suggest resources for that, or should put it in a follow-up message, or how would you like to?
I think that's a really good question, because having conscious travelers go to Africa, for example, when those conservancies, for example, in the Masai Mara, every night you spend in one of those conservancies, there's money that goes directly into conservation, which is great. That's how we're paying salaries of rangers and how we're supporting conservation. And we often find that people want to make the right decisions about where to travel, but it's really hard, right? Because you go onto a website and it's green and we're supporting conservation, and they're actually not. So, Tom, I'd be happy to provide some recommendations in a follow-up email. I think it's a great question.
I believe we're going to be sending out a follow-up to everyone who attended or registered to attend. So maybe we can provide some of those resources.
Absolutely.
In that follow-up communication. Here's a question for you, Sebastián. How is the Huanaco reintroduction in El Impenetrable National Park of Argentina going? Has that been successful?
Yeah, we did the first two translocations. We have the second group on the pre-release pens that we are planning to release like maybe in the next 2 months. And we keep doing more and more translocations. I mean, the guanaco is an incredible example of a herbivore that was completely lost in central and northern Argentina. And with the herbivore, we lost, well, the ecological role, the herbivory process that sustains the grasslands in El Impenetrable. Now we see El Impenetrable that is part of the dry Chaco as a dry forest, but in the past there were big pieces of grasslands that were completely lost because of fire and intensive cattle grazing. And now we are bringing back the guanacos, and in the places where the guanacos are well set, it's incredible how they open the forest to be used to other species. So it's a project that is just starting. It's not one of our newest projects, but so far it's going well. And actually, we translocate. This is another good example also of the few examples in Latin America of wild-to-wild translocation, because we translocate the guanacos from Patagonia to Chaco. It was a 3,200 kilometers journey. We think it's one of the biggest or the longest, if not the longest, land translocations in the world. It takes several days until you arrive to Impenetrable, but so far it's going well. Now that we did the first two translocations that were mostly experimentals, we want to start going much faster this year and the next one.
Kathleen, much of your work is focused not only on finding capital to support conservation, but to create durability of protected areas and protected areas management. Can you describe a little bit about your work with Enduring Earth? What is intended to be accomplished, and what is coming up? What's in the future for this Enduring Earth partnership? This gets to the point, of course, durability over time for rewilding efforts.
Right. No, thanks, Tom, for the question. And durability, of course, is making sure that the good work that, we've heard about, for example, from Sebastián, stands the test of time, right? And as conservationists, traditionally, the way that we've worked is one protected area and then another protected area and then another, right? Because we're faced with constraints of funding and timeframes. Most grants are 3 to 5 years. So Enduring Earth is a partnership with 4 organizations, including Pew Charitable Trust, who I work for, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and Zoma Labs. And we came together 4 years ago around this mechanism, which has a terrible name, but it's called Project Finance for Permanence. And it's essentially a tool to help countries. I mentioned, 63% of the countries in Africa have signed on to protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. So a PFP is a financial tool to support those countries in achieving those objectives, right? So Panama, for example, has set aside 50% of their marine area, 30% of their terrestrial, which is phenomenal. And we're supporting them right now with the PFP, which would help them finance that long term. So basically, it looks at a system approach and says, what do you as a country or a region need to achieve your conservation objectives? How much funding do you need to do that long term? And the funding that we can bring to the table gives them the time as well as the resources to ramp up some of those sustainable finance mechanisms that we were talking about earlier, because that takes time and it takes investment.
Great. We're just a time check. We're going to finish up in about the next 10 minutes. Just a couple of more questions, and then we'll have a last round of comments from our guests. Question posed to both of you: what can individuals do to help you accomplish your work?
Many things, I think. First of all, everyone can do rewilding at their own scale, I think. You can do rewilding in your backyard. I mean, in many countries, especially European countries, that they have a very high population density, but is where rewilding is becoming more and more popular. And they are doing rewilding in the backyards, maybe replacing exotic species with native ones. So insects and birds can also come back, making a small pond. This is something that you can do for sure. Another thing, as we were just mentioning, is go as a tourist to visit places where rewilding is taking place, enjoy wildlife, enjoy local traditions, ask local people, ask the guys about the rewilding projects, because that brings importance to the projects and help support them. Of course, if anyone wants to become a donor, they are welcome. But no, there are many ways. I don't know, putting pressure on governments to restore and to meet the agendas, like the commitments of 30 by 30 that mostly, most of them, or in many cases, they are just commitments that then you don't reach the goals. So there are many things that anyone can do.
Kathleen, did you want to take a stab?
No, I think you summarized that really well. Thank you.
Well, as we are getting close to wrapping up, we've touched briefly on some of the cultural and economic and political challenges for large-scale conservation. And here's a question from an attendee about the ecological context for rewilding. How do you balance nope, sorry. If I started on the wrong one. I'm curious if invasive species have been an issue in any of these featured areas among Pew or rewilding entities, or even Northeast Wilderness Trust managed lands. Have invasive species, or has invasive species control been needed to restore historical species? I'll say on the behalf of Northeast Wilderness Trust, no. For the most part, we have not done much invasive species management. We're not going to pick winners and losers for the most part, but let natural processes take their course. Would either you, Kath, or Sebastián want to take a stab at the invasive species problem?
Yeah, we do have problems, big problems, and we invest a lot in controlling, or if we can, eradicating exotic species. Sometimes it's something that you don't communicate much, because it's maybe not the nicest way of doing conservation, but for sure is very important. I think if anybody wants to learn more about that, it's very interesting to see what the Australian Wildlife Conservancy is doing, because in Australia, the extinction rate of native species because of exotic species is terrible. So there's an incredible organization, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, that they are eradicating exotic species, mostly cats, domestic cats and foxes, in big pieces of land that they are completely fenced. And that's where they are doing then the rewilding of many marsupials that usually they are less than 1 kilo of weight. Yeah, because those are the species that suffered more. In Australia, the extinction of species, at least in the last 100 and something years, is mostly because of exotic species. So it's a really big issue, and there are many organizations working with that. We, for example, and for many organizations, it's like the main work to get rid of exotic species, because without that, you cannot do rewilding.
Yeah, it is. It's a major issue, and oftentimes it's not prioritized just because of a lack of budget for most protected area staff, lack of budget, and they don't have the expertise. There have been some incredible examples in South Africa, for example. They started a Working for Wildlife program where they employed people to remove exotic species. So it was doing two things. One, it was supporting ecological recovery in important watershed areas. And two, it was providing jobs. I just thought it was a great example, because you often hear about this green economy, which is just this big name and it's hard to visualize. And I thought that program, they have Working for Wildlife, Working for Water, and it's all about exotic species and then employing people to manage it, which is great.
We had a really interesting question from an attendee about failure it is inspiring to hear about conservation successes. And there are many we've touched on tonight. And I feel like the work that we're doing at Northeast Wilderness Trust, every time we create a new wilderness preserve and put some more protected areas on the map, that's a win. That's a success. That's a win for nature and for wildlife. But this attendee wonders about and feels like it is helpful to hear about failures. What did not work? What failed in this conservation context? And how did you manage that? How did you personally manage failures and setbacks? Would either of you like to take a stab at telling us something about something that didn't work and how the project or you personally coped with that?
I can say that most of the rewilding projects that we run, they are the first one for the species. So everything is experimental. So every day is almost every day that you have some success and some failure. So, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the entire project fails. But you need to learn from failures, and sometimes failures are much better for learning than successes. The thing is that when you fail with something, you need to think how you overcome that, because sometimes failures, the response to failure is, well, I don't act anymore, and that should not be an option, I think. But yes, we have failures with all the projects. Maybe the main failure it was with the tapir reintroduction project in Iberá, a project that we had to suspend. Mostly maybe not because of intrinsic failures of the project, but we had a parasite, an exotic parasite in Iberá that was brought with cattle that no one knew that affected tapir so badly. So the project was going really well, but suddenly with a high prevalence of the parasite, the tapirs, they started to die, and we had to remove the ones that survived from Iberá. We had to suspend that project. Actually, what is interesting of that is that we think the prevalence of the parasite was really high because the ecosystem was degraded. And now one of the things that we are testing now that we are bringing back, for example, the jaguar, and there's a very big group of researchers from Argentina and from other countries in Iberá trying to understand what are the changes that the jaguar brought to the ecosystem, and the prevalence of some diseases is some of the issues that they are studying. So maybe, who knows, in the futures we can try again with the reintroduction of tapirs, because that prevalence of the parasite maybe was linked to the absence of the big predator and very big abundance of capybaras that were the main host of the parasite. So there's always something interesting about failures that you need to learn.
No, I would agree. I think it's a great question. We talked earlier about funding for projects, public and private funders. And I think oftentimes when organizations fail, they want to just put it aside because they don't want the funders to know about that failure. And I think that's a shame. And we need to create a culture where we are sharing the lessons learned from failing. If you look at how conservation works, I mean, the Conservancy movement in Africa, Kenya started it, Namibia then replicated. Other countries are now looking at that and they're replicating, but if they're not sharing the failures, then those countries are going to repeat the same mistakes. So I think just creating more of a culture where we feel honest and can share, hey, this translocation, there have been translocations of rhinos that have not worked, and no one wants to talk about why that didn't work well. And we need to learn from those examples.
In Africa, something that is very interesting is that the first 8 reintroductions of cheetahs fail. And they keep doing that. And now cheetah reintroductions are working really well. And actually, most of the populations of cheetah are kind of isolated, and they are surviving because people is moving animals from one place to another. But the first 8 fail. And I am kind of envy that situation because, for example, in Argentina, I don't think that if you have that kind of failures, if they allow you to keep trying until you have a good result. And that is very, very important. We need to end with this culture of success,
Yeah.
in which failures are so badly pointed, because failures are very important.
Yeah. When you were talking about that large translocation, the longest translocation, I mean, now with social media, what is so exciting is when there was a translocation of rhinos into Akagera National Park in Rwanda, thousands of people around the world were watching that translocation on a map, which is incredibly exciting. But if things went wrong, that would be really hard for the government of Rwanda and African parks. So it's that double-edged sword.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to have to wrap up. We're about to have the last 5 minutes, and we're going to close on time. I'm sorry to our attendees that we did not get to all of your excellent questions. I'm going to pose one last lightning round to our panelists here, because this series that Northeast Wilderness Trust has been hosting has had a theme this time of wild hope. And Kathleen and Sebastián, what gives you hope?
Well, I think rewilding gives me hope. And I think hope is very important if it's a driver of action. Because rewilding is mostly it's a very positive, proactive, and offensive agenda. Offensive in the good sense of the word, offensive agenda. So that we need a lot. We cannot rely anymore, or not just anymore, that nature will recover by itself. We need to do interventions. We need to act. So I think hope is important if it's a driver of action. Sometimes it's hope, it can be anger also. You can be angry because of some situation that makes you act. So, but in my case, I think rewilding gives me hope a lot.
Yeah, I would say rewilding as well. I mean, if you look, Tom, that black and white slide, for example, that you started this webinar with in the Adirondacks, just total degradation. And then you look at the rewilding today in Adirondack Park, it's extraordinary. So understanding what is feasible with action, dedication. I mean, I think of all the stories that we've covered tonight, it does take dedication, perseverance, but it's incredibly hopeful to see species coming back, trees growing back, and ecological systems rebounding. So that gives me hope.
On that note, I will thank all of you for attending. Certainly want to thank my colleagues, Maddie and Rich and Colby and the communications department here. We really appreciate your presence. Thank you for attending. A last point on hope. Rewilding is the future. And the long history of life on Earth has had tumultuous moments of diversity and flowering and also great contraction. But in the long run, nature bats last. The evolutionary odyssey will continue, and it is a privilege to be working with colleagues like you, Kathleen and Sebastián, and so many folks who are on this webinar who are working to advance the beauty and integrity and diversity and integrity and stability of life on Earth. So thank you very much for all you are doing, have done, and will do in the future to advance that beautiful vision of the Earth rewilding. Thanks very much for coming. Good night.
Thanks a lot to you.
Thanks, Tom.